Good evening. My name is Tony Pendergrass, and I'm the president of San Juan College. We are so excited that all of you are with us tonight for this exciting event. First of all, on behalf of San Juan College, we would like to thank Citizens Bank for sponsoring this Broadening Horizons event. We truly appreciate your generous support. We would also like to extend a special thanks to Beverly Washburn for singing the national anthem this evening in Navajo. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to all of you Mr. Dan Darnell. Dan Darnell has been a resident of San Juan County since the early 80s and retired after 20 years of service with the Farmington Police Department. While he served at the Farmington Police Department, he served as a patrol officer and supervisor, detective, narcotics agent and supervisor, special projects, special response team member, and gang enforcement coordinator. Dan began as a member of the Farmington City Council in 2004. Dan holds an associate's degree in criminology or criminal justice from San Juan College, and he is currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of New Mexico. He has been certified to instruct a number of courses, including workplace ethics, officer survival, firearms trainings, special weapons and tactics, street and prison gangs, grant writing, and general police topics. Dan Darnell has been extremely active with the youth in this community. He has served as the Executive Director of San Juan Safe Communities since 2007. The mission of this organization is to provide a safer community for San Juan County residents through decreasing the use of substance abuse and gang violence, and by helping guide the next generation of healthy, responsible youth. He has also served as a mentor and coach for basketball, baseball, and softball. He has served as a member of the Boys and Girls Foundation Board and is on the American Red Cross Board of Directors. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Dan Darnell. Thank you.
Well, I am here tonight as the Mayor Pro Tem, which is the Vice Mayor of the City of Farmington, on behalf of our Mayor, who has issued a proclamation, and I would like to read that proclamation to you today. San Juan College's One Book, One Community project chose Code Talker by Chester Nez to be read community-wide in 2012 to promote literacy and communication throughout San Juan County. And whereas Chester Nez was born on January 23rd, 1921, and grew up in the checkerboard area of the Navajo Nation, raising sheep and goats with his family. And whereas Chester moved away from his family in the late 1920s to attend boarding school at Fort Defiance, Arizona, and subsequently attended a public school in Gallup, New Mexico, and a boarding school in Tuba City, Arizona. And whereas in 1942, he was recruited for a special project by the United States Marine Corps. And whereas that special project was the Code Talker Project, and Chester Nez became one of the original Code Talkers in World War II. And whereas this group of 29 men, later 32, devised an original Navajo code that was used during the war to transmit messages via radio and telephone in a fraction of the time that it had previously taken to transmit messages. And whereas the Navajo Code Talkers helped assure victory in the South Pacific, which in turn led to a successful conclusion of World War II, with a code that the Japanese were never able to break. And whereas Chester Nez fought with bravery and heroism to protect our freedom, and for that he deserves our respect and our gratitude. Whereas Chester is the last surviving member of the original 29 Code Talkers. Now therefore, the Mayor of the City of Farmington, New Mexico, does hereby proclaim November 1st, 2012 as Chester Nez Day in Farmington. And it encourages all citizens of Farmington to read Code Talker by Chester Nez. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the City of Farmington to be affixed this first day of November 2012, Mayor Tommy Roberts. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you our guest of honor and also the co-author, Judith Avila. Please join me in a rousing welcome to Chester Nez. So on.
I'm going to start today for Chester, and then he will follow up. The first thing I'd like to ask you all to do is for just a few moments to suspend your sense of self and to step into someone else's life. You are a young man, still in high school. Because you are Native American, your friends and your family are not allowed to vote in the state where you grew up, New Mexico. But you were raised as a warrior, and warriors protect the land and the people they love. So when Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was bombed in 1941, you feel pretty sure that you're going to join the fight. Marine recruiters come to your school in Tuba City, Arizona, and they tell the young Navajo men there that they're looking for 30 men who speak perfect English and perfect Navajo. They have a secret mission for these 30 men, but the recruiters won't say what the mission is. You and your roommate, Roy Begay, look at each other and you say to each other, do you think we could make it as Marines? And you decide, yeah, you probably could. So you apply for this secret mission, along with 300 other young Navajo men. You and Roy are selected among the 30. And right after the selection, one of the men drops out. No one knows for sure quite what happened, but that reduces the number of young men to 29. Well, now it's time to go through basic training, and that's pretty scary. You've heard a lot about Marine basic training, and none of you young men know whether you're going to make it through. But it turns out, although basic is tough, life on the reservation and the checkerboard was pretty darn tough too. And all of you do great. You do so well that the Marine Corps Chevron writes about you over and over, talking about you like you were demigods or something. It's quite a surprise to find that you can be a great Marine. Well, when you finish basic training, you're taken aside by an officer, all 29 of you. You're brought to Camp Elliott, which is near San Diego, and you're locked in a classroom. And this classroom is a place that you're going to carry out your secret mission. Well, you're finally told what your mission is. Your mission, the officer says, is to devise a code of communication that the Japanese cannot crack. And it needs to be a code that even another Navajo could not crack. You find out from the officer that the Japanese have broken every single code the Americans have used. And so they're desperate to have something that is new and different, something that no one can break. Well, at first, you guys all look at each other in the room and you think, Navajo? They want us to use Navajo? Because in boarding school, you were severely punished if you spoke Navajo. You were kicked or beaten or had your teeth brushed with that brown Fells naphtha soap, that lye soap. And it's a real shock to think that they might want you to use Navajo for something. But after a short while, all of you realize what a brilliant idea it is. Because Navajo is such a complex language. And there may be 30 people outside the reservation who actually speak Navajo. And so it would be really difficult for anyone to be able to break the code by knowing Navajo, since there are so few people who know it outside of the Navajo reservation. Also, Navajo's not written, which is also a tremendous plus. So very soon you all buckle down to work and you start the business of developing a code. Well, the code seems to work really well. You take 13 weeks in developing and learning and testing it, and you're shipped overseas. And almost immediately you're plunged into battle in Guadalcanal. And it's pretty scary. You can remember sitting at night in the foxhole next to Roy the Gay, who's your foxhole partner, with tears rolling down your cheeks, and both of you saying to each other, will it always be this scary? And both of you answering to each other, yeah, it probably will. But you tell yourself that your family is going to be so, so proud when you get home and they learn how your Navajo language helped to save your country. So you soldier on, or I should say you Marine on, and you don't get killed. Many of your friends do, but you don't. And you make it home. And when you're released from the Marines in 1945, you're told, don't talk about the code. Well, that's kind of tough. People ask you all the time what you did as a Marine. And you tell them, well, I was issued a gun, and I was told to go kill some enemy. So you say nothing about being a code talker. And sometimes it's really hard because your dad is getting old. And you know how proud he would be to know that his Navajo language helped to make the code that defeated the enemy. But you gave your word, so you say nothing. Okay, you can step back into your own lives now. That life I was pulling you into, of course, was the life of Chester Nez. And I'm going to just speak a very brief amount more about what it took, what made those young Navajo men so strong and made them perfect code talker material. And let's see if I can get my clicker to work. Yes. Okay, we'll start with a very quick little primer on the code. And I realize probably people in the back can't see it, but it's okay. You don't have to. I'm not going to give you a test. What they did, these young men, is something very clever. They doubly encrypted the code using English and Navajo. They started with the alphabet. And you can see the alphabet here. I'm going to kind of get out of the way and go over to the side here. They decided they'd just choose an English word for each letter of the alphabet. So, for example, A became ant, simple English word. But they didn't use ant when they said the code. They used the Navajo word for ant, wolachi. And please forgive my pronunciation. I know it's abysmal and pitiful. Anyway, I'm trying. So there was no connection between wolachi and the letter A. I mean, if you look at it, there's no connection. So it was kind of a brilliant idea. And they went on, I think I'm losing my, here we go. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, good. They went on and developed an English word and translated it to Navajo for every single letter of the alphabet. And then they realized, gee, you know, we really need a lot of words that we're going to use commonly. We don't want to have to spell them all out. So they developed a bunch of words for things that were used frequently, like fighter plane or hand grenade or battleship and so on. Now, fighter plane was hummingbird in Navajo. And I can say it phonetically, no laughing, da-he-tee-hee, something like that. Anyway, if you know what a hummingbird is like, you realize what a great word that is to choose for fighter plane, because hummingbirds are so quick and so maneuverable and so vicious if anyone gets between them and their food. And they used other words. The transport plane was an eagle, atsa, and so on. So they used really logical words from their everyday life that they'd be able to memorize and that would make some sort of sense to them, even though hopefully it wouldn't make sense to the Japanese. Well, as it turns out, it didn't make any sense to the Japanese. The code these 29 young men developed became the only unbroken code in modern warfare, which was quite a feat. for 29 men from the reservation in the checkerboard. Now, this shows what the reservation looked like back when Chester was brought into the Marines. It's the large central red portion. Chester grew up in the little square you see of white at the bottom right, the southeast side of the reservation. He was in the checkerboard area in a town called Chechilta, which means among the oak trees. That town was between Gallup and Zuni and was very close to the reservation, but not quite part of it. So it was called the checkerboard because the land owned by his family was Navajo land, Navajo-owned land. And it was side by side with land owned by Anglos or by Hispanic people. So they called that the checkerboard area. Now this is where Chester grew up. This is his grandmother's land. You can see it's kind of built into some cliffs there. These were sheep corrals, and the corrals backed up to those red rock cliffs so the sheep couldn't get out. And the sheep weren't corralled all that often, mostly only if they were sick or hurt and couldn't go out with the rest of the herd, or occasionally newborns were corralled. This is the view from Chester's grandmother's hogan. A really lovely view, but you can see that there was a lot of land for the kids to tramp over. And those kids started at age 5 herding sheep. They'd be gone all day, sometimes all night with the sheep, and Chester told me that there were days they'd walk as many as 17 to 20 miles as little 5-year-olds. So this is the beginning of preparing them to be perfect Marine and perfect code talker material. These kids were tough, boy. They were in great shape and they were tough. Now this is the summer house where Chester and his family lived until he was about the age of 10. Now when you hear summer house, it sounds like, oh, some home that you only live in summer. This is the house where he and his grandmother and his father and his aunts and cousins and brothers and sister all lived all year round. And you can see it's a little, well, there are little gaps, so it wasn't really warm in the winter, and it wasn't really cool in the summer. And it wasn't until he was a little older, 10, 12, that his grandmother actually had a hogan that he helped to build for her. This was one of the hogans on Grandma's land. The roof has collapsed. I took this picture a couple of years ago when we took a trip out to Chechilta. And you don't see the roof here, but you can kind of get a feel for what kind of a solid structure it was. It was made out of logs, and the logs were notched so that they fit together, and then mud was used kind of like adobe in between the logs to fill any cracks. And there were no windows, one door facing east, of course, and there wasn't actually a wooden door at the time he grew up. There was an opening, and it was covered with blankets. And then there was one hole in the ceiling in the middle for the cook stove. So this was luxury compared to the house that Chester had grown up in as a really young child. Okay, we're going to get to this one in a little while, but first, I want to talk a little bit about boarding school. Boarding school for these kids was really tough. They were taken away from the life they knew and loved, from the family they knew and loved, from the sheep and goats who were, as Chester describes him, his best friends when he was a little kid. They'd follow him around as though they were dogs. And he was told by his dad that he was going to have to go to boarding school. Would that be okay? And of course he said, yes, that would be okay, because he knew his dad expected it. But boarding school was tough. He knew no English, and he was not allowed to speak any Navajo. None of the kids were allowed to speak Navajo. If they did, they were severely punished. He also knew that the matrons and the teachers were always watching for them to make a mistake. So he did his best not to make a mistake. But he had that feeling, that cold, kind of rock-like feeling in the pit of your stomach that something's always about to go wrong. Somebody is watching you and you know you're going to do something that isn't right. So it was very tense being in boarding school. It was tough. And he learned to think under pressure. Well, as you can imagine, being able to think under pressure was a huge, huge, huge thing for those young men who joined the Marines. Because when they were out there on the battlefield with bullets whipping by their heads, they had to be able to be coding machines and to speak the Navajo code perfectly and to never make a mistake, because any mistake could mean the lives of their fellow Marines. So boarding school, even though it wasn't a fun experience, was an experience that really strengthened these young men and taught them to think under pressure. Another thing about Navajo life that prepared them was the fact that Navajo relies on oral tradition. At the time Chester was going to school, Navajo was not a written language. And so he'd sit around the fire at night with his grandmother and his father and his brothers and aunts and everyone, and they'd tell stories. And if he wanted to be able to think about that story or repeat it to someone, he had to memorize it, because there was nowhere he could go to look it up and read it again once it had been told to him. He'd have to memorize it, and that's the way it was for everyone. When visitors came to visit, they'd bring all kinds of news, things like the price of lamb, which neighbors were maybe selling their property or moving to a new place, all kinds of news. And if you wanted to be able to visit and tell other people what was going on, you had to memorize that. So the oral tradition was a third huge thing that helped prepare these young men to be successful code talkers. So they were a really hardy group, and they were really well prepared to do the job they'd been assigned to do. Also, another thing in Navajo life that many Anglo people I've talked to have been amazed about was the fact that they could cooperate. I mean, when they were herding sheep, the neighbors all cooperated. Nobody said, you can't bring your herd over here. Shoot. No, they'd let you come and graze on their property. And you'd let their sheep come and graze on your property. And the whole family cooperated in caring for the sheep. And this is something those 29 young men did in that classroom when they developed that unbreakable code. They cooperated, and I think the way Chester explained it to me is it was as though they were one soul, one being. They all worked together. So he was actually perfect code talker material, as were the other 28 young men who worked with him. Now this is Camp Elliott on their way to go become Marines. A scary day. Exciting but scary. I'm sorry, Fort Wingate. Yeah, thank you, Latham. This is Chester's grandson, Latham. He'll correct me if I do anything wrong. And believe me, he takes good care of his papa. This is Chester when he was first recruited. And this is the South Pacific where he fought. Now you can't get a real clear look at the map, but that's okay. All I want you to see is this huge ocean area. And the men were jumping from island to island to island. Sometimes the islands were separated by 1,000 miles and conquering as they went. And so a code, a communications that could not be broken by the Japanese was essential. And this is the kind of boat they use for landing on the islands. It's called a Higgins boat. And this Higgins boat has, as you can see, a flat panel in the front that flipped down and became kind of a ramp. So when you got close to shore, you'd flip down that flat panel and the men could go out onto shore or into water not too terribly deep, close to shore. And these are just, I'm going to flip through the islands where Chester fought. He was at Guadalcanal first, and that was a 6-month battle. The Code Talkers were there for 3 of those 6 months because they came in the middle of the battle. Then he went to Bougainville, and that was, I believe, around 3 months, that battle. Then he went to Guam, which was shorter, and to Peleliu, which many historians say was the bloodiest battle of World War II. I always thought it was Iwo Jima, but a lot of historians disagree and say that it was Peleliu. And this is Angkor, which is a tiny little island that can only be reached by boat. It had no airport or anything at the time, airstrip. And he went there to help his army friends and was captured by an army guy who thought he was a Japanese wearing a Marine's uniform. Not a good thing. This is Chester, a posed picture. This is Chester's wife, Ethel. And this is a drawing that Chester did. He was quite an artist, and one of the drill instructors in the Marines asked him if he would make a picture for him. And this is the one he drew for him. And when that drill instructor heard about the book, he sent this picture an email and said, "Look what I have from Chester. It's so exciting." This is Chester again as a young man. And here we have Chester just after the war and just a couple of years ago. The 2 pictures are separated by, several months. This is Chester out in the checkerboard area where he grew up at his sister Dora's house, which still did not have electricity when she died in 2008 and still has no electricity, but it's a nice little house. And he is there with his son Mike, with whom he lives now in Albuquerque. And these are some Code Talkers who visited the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque with Chester. They were honored there. There was an exhibit brought through the Pueblo Cultural Center that was quite good. And this is what happened in 2001. Finally, in 2001, after the code had been released from secrecy, and that happened in 1968, so it took a while before the men actually got formally recognized by Congress. But after they released the code, more and more people found out about the job they had done, and more Marines were able to talk about these men that they'd worked with, and they were able to tell us how big a difference these men made in our being able to win the war. And in 2001, the original 29 Code Talkers, the men who first developed the code, were granted the Congressional Gold Medal, which is and that is the highest civilian honor that Congress can bestow. Of course, by then, the men were all civilians. And there Chester is, getting his medal from President Bush. And some of you may have seen the movie Wind Talkers. Yeah, you recognize that guy, huh, in the middle? Poor ugly guy, you know? Chester was asked to help with promoting the movie, and he said the movie was actually quite good. There were some Hollywoody things, like no bodyguard ever had to shoot his Code Talker that he was guarding. But it was a good movie. It didn't go into the Code Talker function enough to satisfy me, but he is here with Adam Beach and with his dad, his son, Mike. And this is Chester's lovely family. In the back is his son, Mikey. Next to Mikey, the shorter one, is his great-grandson, Emery. Next to Emery is his grandson Latham, who's with us today. Next to Latham is Chester's son Mike. And then on the bottom row, his granddaughter Shania, Chester of course, and his daughter-in-law Rita. And I tell you, his family is a wonderful family, and they were all so solid behind our doing this book. They did everything they could to help while we were putting the book together. And I would go over to Chester's family's house and read things I'd written to make sure I hadn't gotten them wrong. And Rita, his daughter-in-law on the bottom there, who's a good buddy of Chester's, she speaks Navajo, and they speak Navajo back and forth all the time together. She'd hear a sentence and she'd run out and say, "That's wrong, that's wrong." And she'd explain to me exactly why a Navajo would not have said it that way. And so we have to thank Rita, too, for this book. She really was a wonderful help. The whole family was great. And there we are. There's our book. Some of you have probably seen it. Now I'd like to have Chester say a few words to introduce himself. And tell them.
My name is Chester Naz. My family is Black Sheep, and my father was Ten House with me, Sleeping Rock. I am very glad to tell you that I am so proud to have served my country and the people of the United States.